Well, good afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing? Pretty good here, and welcome to the channel. Hey, today I want to get on here and talk about the manual transmission, specifically in mid-size trucks. Does a manual transmission even matter anymore? You know, someone asked me a question recently. They said, is Tacoma the only manual transmission, or the only maker that you can get a manual transmission from now? And I got to thinking, I don't know. So I went out and I did some research. I looked at the Ford Ranger, no manual transmission. I looked at the Nissan Frontier, there was a manual transmission there. And I looked at the Chevy Colorado, no manual transmission. So out of what I'll call the mid-size truck market in the US, there are only two, Toyota and Nissan. So why get a manual transmission? Why does it even matter anymore? You know, I learned how to drive on a manual transmission, so maybe I'm a little tainted, I don't know. But first of all, I think they're the fun factor. They're fun to drive. They're fun to drive because you can go through the gears, you can run them out however you want, you can get the high revs out of it if that's what you're looking for, or you can just cruise nice and smoothly. They're a blast to drive. Secondly, you can control the transmission yourself. In other words, you can control how high the engine revs. You can control how long you run that gear out. You can't do that in an automatic. Even if you go with those little shift paddles, you know, so you're faux manual driving, it still will shift for you if you let it go too far. It will not let you blow up your motor. You know, that's important. You need to have the ability to blow up your motor or your transmission if you want to. Next up is, there's no lag in a manual transmission. I mean, other than that friction point when you're letting off the clutch, pushing on the gas, and hoping that you go forward if you're new and don't just stall out. But otherwise, there is no lag point. Once you get it going and you get it into gear, you're going. You don't have to wait for the transmission to engage, to kick in, to shift for you. That's a big complaint. There's a lot of complaints that I've heard out there on the Tacoma in the automatic transmission. It's lack of responsiveness, it's gear searching, never knows where it wants to be. This is what a lot of folks say. And you don't have that in the manual because it's you. You're the one that decides what gear you're in. And I have heard, and we're going to find out, because I have one on order in the 2020 Tacoma, if it's true, if the manual transmission in the Tacoma is really superior to the automatic. Now, another thing that I'll mention, and as dumb as this sounds, it's true. It's so true that a big car company actually spent money to make a commercial in which this was a fairly big component of it. And that's theft deterrence. I mean, it makes sense, right? If a thief is going to try to steal your car and he doesn't know how to drive a manual, he can't steal your car, right? It's going to move on to the next one. In the commercial that I mentioned, they actually showed a couple guys pulling up somewhere, and the guy got out and they both start walking away, and the other dude says, "Aren't you going to lock the car?" And he says, "Why?" And they show the gear shifter, that it's a manual transmission. So it's becoming so prevalent that so few people know how to drive a manual today that they're even throwing it into mainstream commercials. I think it's hilarious. I also heard a story a while back about I think it was a lady that was in her car and someone was going to carjack her. But once they discovered that it was a manual transmission, they left because they didn't know how to drive one. So what are the disadvantages to having a manual transmission? Well, the first thing is, and I find this out myself, they are scarce new. So if you're looking to order a Tacoma in this case, and you're hoping to grab one in the pipeline, or maybe, you know, Toyota's just building some for stock so they can sell them at the dealers, you're not going to have much luck. As in my case, there was only one, as I mentioned, and it was already sold. So you're going to have a longer lead time. If you think that you're going to go in and snag one that's already in the pipeline, it's probably not going to happen. Next, they are a drag, I will admit, in heavy rush hour traffic. You know, before I moved to Texas, I lived in Columbus, Ohio. And I drove the freeway both to work and home from work every day, along with I don't know how many tens of thousands of other people. Bumper to bumper, stop and go traffic, and it sucked. You're constantly shifting, you're constantly pushing on the clutch and the brake because you never get going fast enough to maintain any gear. And if you've driven a manual and you're familiar with them, you know that you can kind of lag along a little bit, but if you don't get in the right gear, you start jumping around because you're in the wrong gear. And that is a drag in rush hour stop and go traffic. I must admit, it is. Next up, typically, all of your family members won't be able to drive a manual transmission. I've heard from a lot of people on the channel, in the forums, on Instagram, about their spouse not being able to drive a manual transmission. So they can't buy one. And if they did, and let's say for some reason, I don't know, there was an emergency, or maybe you had the other car and your spouse needed to go somewhere, assuming you have two vehicles, and they couldn't drive the manual, that's going to create problems because they can't go anywhere. A minor thing it might sound like, but try it a few times and you'll find out it's probably not. Clutch wear. You know, you've got a clutch, obviously, that you operate in a manual transmission. If you don't do it very well, and you're not very masterful at it, that's going to become a maintenance item. It's going to wear out. You know, have you ever heard someone grinding a clutch? You know, that it's horrible. It's like someone stepping on your foot. I don't know. It's a horrible feeling. And if you're not great at it, you're going to spend a little money replacing those, and it's not cheap to do. This next one happened to me, and this is horrid. Service shop or service personnel most likely are not going to be able to drive a transmission. You'll be lucky if there's someone at the shop, and there should be. I mean, if it's a shop that should be able to drive a manual so that you don't have to worry about that kid jumping in your car and grinding your gears the whole way he's trying to get it inside. What happened to me, I actually shipped a manual transmission from Ohio to Texas when we moved. And it never really dawned on me that maybe I ought to be asking some questions and be aware. Are the guys that are moving this from me, do they know how to drive a manual transmission? In my case, they did not. When the car was brought to within, I think it was like 5 miles of my house or something, a fella got in it that had never driven a manual transmission before. When it showed up at my house, it was smoking and smelled like it was burning. That's because the guy rode the clutch the whole way. He didn't know how to drive a manual transmission. Something that never should have happened. I don't know why a company would turn a vehicle over to someone who's not driven a manual. But the guy stated when he got here, this is the first time he'd ever driven a manual. Isn't that nice? Resale value. It only makes sense that since there are so few people, it seems anymore, that know how to drive a manual, they're going to be more difficult to sell because people don't want them. That's going to make them worth less money because if the dealer can't turn them, or you can't turn them yourself, people aren't going to pay as much for them. At least someone who's going to put them more into inventory, like a dealership. You're going to get less money for it, so you need to know that going in. If you pick up a manual and you're going to be looking to trade it down the road, it's going to take longer to sell and you're probably going to get less for it. Last up, no crawl control in the case of the Tacoma. If you're a rock crawler or a heavy off-roader and you want that rock crawl or crawl control feature, you don't get that in a manual transmission. You have to have an automatic. A lot of people talk about the automatic being better for off-roading, at least rock crawling, because you're not trying to shift gears while you're in mid-crawl or something. So you might want to consider that depending on what your use of the truck is going to be. If you're just doing normal off-roading, I don't see any issue with it. I mean, after all, that's what was used for years before the automatic started to take over. So, what do I think? The manual transmissions days are numbered. You know, only 2 manufacturers that sell them in the US right now, and they're difficult to get a hold of. It won't be long. It won't be long now. You won't be able to get one at all in a mid-sized truck. And I can't blame the dealerships for this. I mean, if the demand was there, they would still carry them. All the other manufacturers would carry them because they're in business to make money. And if there's a demand for a product and someone else is carrying it and you're not making any money. So it's really a factor of the public's demand. People just don't want them anymore. People aren't learning how to drive them. And I think within the next 5 years or so, maybe sooner, the manual transmission is going to be gone. Matter of fact, in my opinion, I think they're already dead. They're still straggling out there a little bit, and there's a few of us purists out there who want them, but we're not enough to support the market. No one is going to make a living selling manual transmissions to the few of us that still want them versus the masses that do not. Anyway, I just wanted to get on here and talk about that a little bit. I found it interesting when somebody asked me if there was anyone other than Toyota that sold a manual transmission, and I wasn't sure, so I thought it was kind of interesting. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Am I wrong? Is the manual transmission alive and well and it's going to be here forever? Let me know. As usual, appreciate you guys watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on the web. Have a great day. Bye.